Chapter 10. The Balance. Maintaining balance as you lead is critical. Avoiding extremes on the journey, too controlling, and you'll quash creativity and innovation. Too lax, and your team will feel directionless. But the moment you think you've got it figured out, you'll find an exception. Stay open, stay humble, experiment, and find what works for you. In the phase of my career before I'd adopted a leadership mindset, and in roles that confer leadership responsibilities, I found that many of the managers I directly reported to tended to gravitate toward one extreme or another. In some cases, they were painfully authoritarian, and in other cases, I watched as people dismissed them as pushovers and walked all over them. I noticed how anytime one of my managers opened his mouth, I could be reasonably sure that he was levying criticism. He was very different from the manager who never had a bad thing to say about anyone or anything, who was an unrelenting cheerleader, even when what the team needed was a course correction. In my own leadership roles, I've often noticed how difficult it is to not over-rotate in a desire to avoid coming across a certain way. I went through a period when I was adamant about not being a dictator, so I made sure to always engage my team and ask for ideas. But I took it too far. We started missing deadlines, or going through easily avoidable mistakes because I refused to assert myself, even when it was the right move. I tend to be optimistic, but in my leadership roles, that has sometimes put me in a position where the team has been ill-prepared. I assumed everything would go according to plan and refused to acknowledge how much work really needed to be done. My optimistic posture made me naive. Great leadership is always a balance that stops the inevitable slide into the extremes. In most cases, leaders will find themselves choosing between two options in an either-or framing. Commonly, you might ask whether you should be unilateral versus collaborative, high control versus laissez-faire, optimistic versus naive, strict versus lenient, praiseful versus critical. Rarely is a situation truly about either or, but it is often about understanding the balance between two opposing ends of a spectrum, and the ideal mix in the middle. Let's explore balance on each of these spectrums. Unilateral versus collaborative. Who makes the decisions? Should it be you, or should it be your team? This is not an either-or decision. In some circumstances, you should make the decision on your own, but you should always be mindful of how a decision impacts the team. For example, a client wants to move the deadline for a project up by 1 week. This is an important client, and their contract alone helps pay 2 people's salaries. So, what do? You are the leader. This is your privilege, burden, and responsibility. Think about the impact on your team, but also think about how this may affect the relationship with the client. This is a tough decision. Make the call. Similarly, plenty of decisions absolutely should be made collectively. An aligned team is unlikely to make a decision the leader would not approve of. Let's imagine that you are looking to hire a new team member. You have a small 6-person team, and there are currently 3 strong applicants in the final round of interviews. When it comes to making the final decision, your team needs to be involved. They need to tell you why they like one candidate over another. They need to share what skills they think are important. The culture of your team is critical for the performance and health of your team. Don't risk a gut decision without making sure that it isn't in conflict with how your team sees things. Balance exists when, regardless of who makes the decision, it carefully considers what you, as the leader, would do, while also accounting for the impact on the rest of the team. Your team is not going to like every decision you make, but if they understand how you make decisions and they trust you, knowing that you care about each of them, they will defer to your judgment. You're not going to like every collaborative decision, but if you trust that your team is aligned and that they respect your perspective, then you should defer to their judgment. A strong team shares values and purpose, and therefore whether you or someone else or the team decides, everyone should be able to align with it. High control versus laissez-faire. There are 3 types of events in this world: events you can control, events you can influence, and events you can do nothing about but accept. Don't confuse these or mistakenly believe that you can control much. It will only make you angry. Life has a funny way of shaking that belief to the ground. Likewise, don't fall victim to believing you have to accept much in this world. More often than not, you can stand up and influence an event. Improving your ability to distinguish between these types of events is important. Here's an example to illustrate the difference between control, influence, and acceptance. If a team member at work is constantly coming in late in the morning, control could look like a verbal warning followed by formal disciplinary measures and possible termination. It could also look like offering accountability calls or giving this person a ride to work in the morning. That's control. Influence could look like finding common goals to align with and working together to address the underlying problem that being late may create for the team. Acceptance could be letting the team member continue to come in late and letting the team know why the exception is being made. None of these approaches is inherently right or wrong. They are just different methods of dealing with a situation. However, when determining which is the right approach for a given situation, consider this. You can only control situations in which there are no other significant competing forces, and these situations are few and far between. As a result, you can typically control situations only where your own behavior and actions are in question. Seek to control situations only where the stakes, stress, or complexity are high and where exerting yourself has a low risk of unintended consequences. For instance, your team may look to you to step up and take control when a decision needs to be made under a tight timeline. You may want to take over a sales meeting when it comes time to close. Control is, more often than not, an illusion, and your desire to attempt to control should be kept to a minimum. Often, where control may be your first instinct, influence will be a much more appropriate response. Rather than trying to exert your authority to get someone to change their behavior, you will find much more success if you can influence them to change gradually. Influence is more appropriate in any situation where there are multiple competing forces or where being too heavy-handed can produce unintended consequences. If a situation looks hopeless and you feel as though acceptance is your only option, ask yourself whether there is any chance for you to make an impact. If the answer is yes, then you should continue to try influencing the situation. Acceptance should be reserved for those scenarios where even influence would be overstepping your boundaries, or where either control or influence would be futile. Too often, leaders get drunk on authority and feel as though they need to have an opinion on everything in their field of vision. While you will always have the option to control, influence, or accept, I recommend you lead towards influence. In general, the best long-term solution is to help your team members grow so that they are better able to help themselves in the future. Great leaders often look for an individual's natural ability and leverage those abilities to help them grow as a leader on the team. According to a study by the University of Birmingham's Business School, a survey of 20,000 employees found that the primary factor in job satisfaction is autonomy. The more control exerted over an employee, the lower the job satisfaction. Despite this, leaders still choose to exert varying degrees of control over their team members because they believe it to be the most effective strategy. Some leaders crave power and submission. They take a hands-on approach to ensure that their vision is being implemented according to plan. For these types of leaders, team members are cogs in the machine. They are utilitarian and often replaceable. The leader and their plan, and ego, are the real stars of the show. Avoid this approach. At the other end, some leaders adopt a laissez-faire approach. They believe in letting people make mistakes so they can learn from them. Depending on the other aspects of the person's leadership, this can be very effective or fail miserably. It really falls on how well they support in the moments of failure and build a culture around learning. Optimistic versus naive. Believing in your people is a good thing, as is optimism about your team's chance of success. Being blind to reality is a different situation. Be the first one to encourage and inspire others and motivate your team to believe in the possibility of success. However, know that taking this to an extreme could lead people to see you as naive and unrealistic, and just try to motivate, inspire, and encourage them when that happens. Your positivity must be grounded in reality, not in a place of foolishness. Be optimistic in the face of adversity, but take a sober look at reality too, and always be truthful about it with your team. Unfortunately, balance doesn't exist at some magical point on the spectrum between optimism and naivete. You simply have to feel it out. Your optimism should account for reality and consider the variables. Your tone should reflect realism so that you maintain credibility. Strict versus lenient. My best friend and I both played sports in high school. I liked the coaches who encouraged me and helped me grow. He liked the coaches who yelled in his face and pushed him to his limits. There is no objectively right answer about how to strike a balance between strict and lenient, because people react in different ways based upon how they were raised and on their life experiences. You'll have to tailor your style to the individuals on your team, knowing what it takes to get the best out of each of them. Some people need support and coddling. Some people need strict rules and discipline. Dennis Rodman went to Las Vegas for a 48-hour bender in the middle of the Chicago Bulls' 97-98 championship season. Coach Phil Jackson approved it. Would you have let him go? Well, The Bulls won the championship and Rodman suited up for 80 games. That said, a team that takes ownership likely doesn't need a leader to enforce strict rules and won't suffer if the rules are lenient. Where there is trust, you can course correct with either strictness or leniency when the projects don't go perfectly according to plan. Here's a tip: don't be a pushover. As you probably know by now, being a lovable leader doesn't mean letting the tough stuff go. When you care about your team members, you bravely face conflict and difficult conversations. You realign team members who go off track. You hold people accountable to their responsibilities. Precisely because you care, you stand your ground. If you mistake being loved with being liked, you risk becoming a pushover, and the entire team suffers. When any member of the team disrespects the leader and gets away with it, it signals to the rest of the team a breakdown of respect and roles. The leader's job requires getting people to take ownership and action. Whether you are strict or lenient in how you accomplish that is a matter of personal style. However, your approach should always be supported by strong bonds with your team, substantial trust for one another, and deep respect. When you have this, you will be effective. Praiseful versus critical. As a leader, words are your most commonly used tool. Some people take the concept of being generous with praise too far and wind up walking around the office giving out compliments for anything anyone does. When you give too much praise, you diminish its impact because there is functionally no difference between big wins and common expectations. On the other hand, when you criticize too much, you cultivate a culture of fear and diminish people's motivation. There is a delicate balance between praise and criticism, but I would offer that the ideal balance for a leader falls further toward praise than criticism. People want to feel important and to be appreciated. Similarly, people are far more likely to obsess over their shortcomings than to acknowledge, embrace, and recall their successes. Sometimes constructive criticism is important, useful, and necessary. Offer it in a spirit of goodwill and care so that it is well received as possible. Frame it in service of the other person's growth and as a product of your care. Lovable Leader's Cheat Sheet. To maintain balance in all aspects of my leadership, I will avoid going to extremes. Sometimes make unilateral decisions instead of collaborative ones. Sometimes need to assert control, and sometimes need to let go. Ensure my optimism is not naive. Cater my strictness and leniency to individuals. Balance my praise and criticism. Seek to understand what I need to do to bring out the best in each individual.